David Shapiro, 50 years. I can't actually believe it. I read your column in Business Day, when was it, last week? And you said on the 1st of February, it will be exactly 50 years since you stepped onto the floor at the JSE. Now, your dad, Archie, he was also a legend on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Was it always decided that young David would be following in Archie's footsteps?
No, not at all. In fact, my dad had a tough upbringing. Was brought up. His dad died at a very early age. He never had. He couldn't go to university, and so he came from the south, from Turfentine, Rosettenville. Never forgot his roots, but he was very fortunate in the midst of the Depression to get a job. There was I never understand what happened, but there was an opening that got him into the stock exchange, and he stayed there ever since. And he was a wonderful trader. Of course, the next generation went to university, and I did accountancy, and I was never going to be a trader on the floor. You had to have a special skill to do that, and don't ever underestimate the skills of traders as opposed to what Harold, my older brother, and myself were analysts. We were accountant analysts and that. But I went onto the floor. I loved the floor. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a big, big learning curve, and there was a lot that I learned from there. But, as the years progressed, so I developed in other areas. And as you know, my dad was a raging gold bull. I'm probably the opposite.
Well, at least you don't go short on gold. But David, it is interesting. No. So you went to Wits, you then studied accountancy, you were a chartered accountant. That's a respectable career. I mean, trading on the floor on the JSE, certainly from the way that I remember those days, there used to be occasional punch-ups when you were shouting out. Just give us a bit of color there. The way that you traded those days, how did the orders come in, and how were they executed?
They were about 1/100th the efficiency of the markets that we have today, because everything was literally done on scraps of paper. And you would get orders in that came via telex, via telephone, and you would run to a dealer. And this dealer had to shuffle these orders through his pad. Now, remember, he was dealing in a segment of the market. So he was covering, I don't know, it could be, if he was the gold trader, he was probably covering 30, 40, 50 shares. And he had to shuffle these, especially in the busy times. The one thing that I loved about it, you knew when a market was busy. You could actually feel the pulse, of a market. And I loved that. And I loved the camaraderie. I loved the community, the community. We haven't got a community today. We don't have a financial community. If we do, it's disparate. It's all over the place. But there, everybody was mates with each other. And, Monday morning you'd come in and discuss whether it was the golf, the rugby, the cricket, and so there were very strong friendships that were formed in those years, which continue today. A lot of the chaps who were on the floor, remain friends, even though they were dealing with opposite firms. So I miss that. And there was a big learning curve there. Alec, you learned a lot about human nature. You learned a lot about trading, about markets, far more so than you do, I think, on the screen-based systems and that.
I remember watching from the gallery, which was all glassed in, and you could then look down at these grown men who were running around shouting at the top of their voices, buy this, sell that. And then there were people who were markers, I suppose you called them, who were standing on these big boards and writing in chalk. Yeah, writing in chalk when the share prices change. Yep. I mean, that's like a world away from where we are today. Totally.
I think if I go back on 50 years, the biggest change has been the technological change. Having come from an open outcry market to where we are today. In fact, you wrote, I read yesterday an article you wrote for a magazine called Leadership in 1987.
Wow.
Which was the centenary. And you were actually writing on the change of technology, because in 1987 we were starting to use computers for research. That was the start. I mean, the big leap came when we went electronic in 1996 with the internet. But I mean, we were starting to to get used to putting research onto spreadsheets and so on. So one day I'll send you that article. I'm sure you've got it in your archives, but I was just catching up yesterday. But that was Alec, when I came onto the market in 1972, there was no direct dialing to London or to anywhere. So if you wanted to deal with your counterparts in London, you used to have to book a call through the operator, and it'll come through half an hour later. And we dealt in telegrams and we dealt in telex, coded telegrams. And so communication, understand this, communication to get information from London, respond to it, send back an answer was a half an hour. Today it's instantaneous. Now that half an hour opened massive gaps for what they called in those days arbitrage, taking advantage of price differences between shares that were, South African shares that were trading in London and South Africa. And of course, we had those counterparts in Zurich, Brussels, Paris, London, New York. So it was quite an international market in that, and it worked. And besides that, we were dealing in the blocked rand or the security rand or the financial rand. It wasn't just straight currency dealing.
If you couldn't,
that was the 70s, yeah.
If you couldn't calculate quickly, you couldn't do, who was it, the one Springbok coach who was counting on his hands one day, on his fingers. But David, I recall when I started, which was not too long after your first day on the floor when I started in journalism, Penelope Gracie was my boss. As it sounds, she was female. And Penelope was not allowed into the Rand Club. When she went to the Rand Club for business lunches, she had to be spirited in through the back entrance. What was it like at the JSE when you arrived there, and maybe the transformation? I think it was some years before Penny could go through the front door at the Rand Club. What was it like for women at the JSE then?
The same thing. I think the first female member was Anne McCurtain, which, if I recall, was in 1976. It might have been slightly later, but that was the first. That's when they started to allow females in. The strange thing is that I worked for a firm called Max Pollock and Fremantle, and Eric Fremantle had applied in the 50s for a lady who was working for him, Betsy McLaren, to become a member. And I mean, you can't believe how the committee objected and, what he went through. And the reason they finally gave him was that there were no female toilets by the trading floor. In other words, there weren't facilities. So he was ahead of his time, and he felt that she'd given so much to the firm that she was entitled to be a partner. In order to be a partner, you had to be a member. But it was only much later that, that they started to admit females. I think I'm trying to think when they first allowed, the first non-white was Sikhi Ibrahim, which I recall was probably 1981, an Indian chap. He's still with us. Well, his son still works with me today, and I think that was in the early 1980s.
David,
so it was different.
Looking back over 50 years, I know you did touch on this in your Business Day column, but I'd love you just to repeat it for us, the big lessons that you've learned about investing in this wealth of experience that you have been exposed to.
I think management is very important. That was the one lesson. But I'm just going to put that aside. We can come back to it. The one lesson I learned, and I have so many examples, are of ordinary people who built wealth just by being clever, buying the right kind of shares and sticking with them. And I remember I used to often go down to Somerset West, and I'd meet people there that I was talking to. I was giving a talk and they would come and attend. And afterwards, they were proud to show me their portfolios. And here, they were very simple folk, lawyers, doctors, the local doctor, the local lawyer, accountant, etc. They had backed Johan Rupert. And they had portfolios in those days were in the multi-million rands. And they had just supported him. I was very privileged to work for a gentleman by the name of Gus Lipschitz. And then in the 1990s, Gus saw the change in the South African economy. And he said, you know what? We're going to have a new middle class, and they're going to spend. I'm going to buy Ellerines. I'm going to buy Cashbuild. I'm going to buy Bidvest. And all he did, he would choose one stock or two stocks a year and just build up he wasn't a man who boasted about the money. But when I saw how clever, how these gentlemen had built by just following the right kinds of business, just how successful they were. They never switched and changed and went into diversified portfolios, or let's call it balanced portfolios. They just stuck to their strategy. And I think it's a massive lesson. If you find the right kind of companies, just stay with them. You know what I mean? You know from Berkshire, just have a look at the multi-billionaires that have been made just following Warren Buffett, from the early ages. Simple, easy folk, lived in Omaha and amassed a massive fortune. And I'm saying, it's not difficult. It sounds more difficult. Just find the right companies, and know the management as well. Management, very, very important. Know that they're acting on your behalf, and that's the other lesson. Know that they're not acting for their own self-enrichment, but rather to build a legacy, company, a legacy company, and also to look after your interests.
So where do you start on both of those? First of all, finding the right companies, and secondly, trusting the management, or knowing which management is trustworthy.
Okay. Time. You know what we do? We suddenly find, we're listening to the media. I'm talking mainly television, and you're listening to, and they come up with a new company that's coming out with a new product. Just wait. You've got to give management time. I always say it's like a relationship. You don't find a pretty girl and on the first date she's great and she looks attractive and she's fun and you want to marry her the next day. It takes time. It takes time to build a relationship. You have to learn about her, her quirks. You have to learn about her family. Is this someone you want to be with in the next 5, 10, 50, 20 years? So I think it's the same thing. We're too quick, to judge companies. And I say the same thing now for almost cryptocurrency. We don't know it. Wait. You don't have to make your fortune tomorrow. So I think it's very important to understand a company, and it takes you time to actually build that trust in the management, of the business and understanding the business. The other thing is themes, and that's why I like to look at the themes and say, okay, what's in the same way as Gus said, listen, I see a new middle class coming. It's going to take 5, 10 years, and that's how he built his wealth. He says they're going to get money and they're going to spend. And I think in the same way, we have to look at those kind of businesses that we think are going to be dominating in the next 5 to 10 years and run with it, go with it, make that judgment call. And look, some will fail. It's okay. 1 or 2 will fail. You don't have to let your ego get in the way, but go with it. So, we have too many financial people out there, advisors who are constantly at you, trying to get you to change, shift, to go, you've got to go here, you've got to go there. Just ignore them. Just do your own thing. You've got to look after your own money and just be conscious of where you're going.
In all that time, in those 50 years, you would have met some remarkable people. Just off the top of your head now, within broking, within the community, who is the one person who perhaps was a role model or stood out for you? And then outside of that, in the business community generally?
I think we had, when I go back to the magnets that we had, those huge giants of business that we had in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I think when I look back on South African, the South African companies, when you look on someone like Donnie Gordon, who was so far ahead of his time in the way that he built Liberty. Unfortunately, I think times went against him, but when you look at how Liberty just ran ahead of all those businesses, I think I'm trying to, SA Breweries was always a model for me. I think always, and I still think to this day, within their own internal business. They're a very good structure. But we had the Tiger Brands, we had all the property cover, we had some superb businesses that were run there. Anglo-American, you used to take your shoes off when you used to go to 44 Main Street. It was like a shrine. And you could feel the power. Do you know what I mean? You could feel the power of those businesses. And, South Africa in that era was a very powerful nation. We were a mining nation at a time when, mining was an important, very important industry. And a lot of industries were built around that, and so I think those were the not models, I think we revered them. We always revered those kind of people, and they had a certain power and magnetism, which I don't find is there today. There's some very good managers here, and we've got some very great businesses, but nowhere near the kind of stature that those kind of people commanded and had. And so I found that was a very good learning, a lesson for me as well. Unfortunately, things have changed. I think the country, we let it slip. And it wasn't, when I say we let it slip, during the 90s, we took our eye off the ball, and then we thought that the Chinese would continue forever, buying commodities. And we suffered from the Dutch disease in the sense that we thought, commodities would always save us. We never thought that commodity prices would come down. But I mean, if you look at the industrial companies that we had, whether it was from clothing, furniture manufacturers, etc. So there were so many kind of people that kind of shaped my thinking and education. I think today I'm trying to think who I admire. I've always admired Buffett. He's a one man, and that era. That why? Because he's just down to earth. Mm. You know what I mean? And he's got such a wonderful philosophy on life. I think it just covers every aspect of it. And I think if I had to shape myself, it would be around the way that he has approached investment. There's never been, and I don't even think he's out of date at this stage. I don't think that he has ever gone out of date in his thought. You might apply it differently, but when you read what he says, and I advise every young person, not just to hear what he said. Listen to Charlie the other day. 97, still coming out with pearls of wisdom, absolute pearls. Even though he was pro-China, but when you listen to his arguments, they're actually valid. So I love those two men. And my heart will go when they, because they're 91, 97. Please God, they can live for another decade or so.
Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. David, what about you? How much longer are you going to be involved in the stock market? Given perhaps you've got your dad did more than 50 years. How far did Archie? What was his record, and is it something that you're going to?
He went through to 83, 93, 95, right through to the end. Sadly, when we went electronic, that was the end. 1996. He had Alzheimer's in his latter years, which was very sad. To see a man of his, he was always gregarious, outgoing. He was, I couldn't keep up with him. I couldn't keep up with his energy. I went on one trip to London, a business trip, and I was gone. I just couldn't go at the same kind of pace that he could go at. But that was his character. But I've got no intention of retiring. I think we don't have to. Do you know what I mean? This is not a physically demanding job. You can be here for a long time, and I enjoy keeping up with the news, and I enjoy trying to work out. Trying to say, okay, what's happening in the world? Where's it going? Which are going to be the new companies? Where must we put our money? What are going to be those cash bulls or the Ellerians, and that maybe in a global context. And I think that's always a challenge to seek them out. So I continue to read. I continue to test my knowledge. But I think we're going into an exciting era. Massively exciting area with this whole digital transformation. So don't think this is over. I think we're going into, there's going to be a lot of action in the next 10 years.